Well, I don't agree with his policy direction. I think it's the wrong direction.
Like, what is there? It's just a build and spend and borrow budget. And again, that's kind of been the
Yeah.
theme for the last 2 decades.
I think we need to rely upon uh, free markets as much as we can because people are going to look after their own money uh, much better than the government will look after it.
Well, g'day and welcome to yet another episode of The Other Side Unplugged. I'm Damian, and this is our rough and ready, back of the garage type show where we dive into current issues and we put up every couple of weeks for you an episode of some of the finest thinkers around the country on different issues. And we've got a couple of very fine thinkers for you today. Don't forget The Other Side, our main show, is now fortnightly every second Friday night, and the next episode will be episode 406 coming to you next Friday, which is April the 4th. But tonight, on The Other Side Unplugged, I'm very pleased to welcome to the studio once again a regular on the show, Mr. Dan PETRIE, former Bloomberg editor and journalist and News Corp journalist. Always great to have Dan on. Dan, welcome once again to the show.
Thank you, Damien. Looking forward to breaking down the budget, if that's what we can call it. Not many highs or lows, but looking forward to the next wee while as we chat through it.
Yep, and also TUNNY is joining us from Adept Economics. Gene is a director at Adept Economics and one of the leading economic thinkers across Australia, and well known to many of you for his own podcast and writings. Also been on the show a few times. Gene, it's great to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to catch up, Damian.
I guess I'll start with you, Gene. If you want to tell us just overall overview of the federal budget, what was your general takeaway?
Well, it obviously framed in terms of the election, so it's not what economists or former Treasury officials like me would want to see in the federal budget. There's an acceptance of these ongoing deficits, the significant structural deficit, the fact that we're spending too much for the revenue that we raise. There's a small tax cut because they couldn't afford much more without making the situation much worse. There's the electricity relief. They did, again, it's not as much as last time. What is it, $150 versus 300? So look, it's what they can afford, what they think they need to spend to try to help them win the election. It's not framed in terms of what's the best budget for the well-being of Australians. It's framed in terms of what's the best budget for ensuring the re-election of the current government.
Yeah, what's your take, Dan? Do you see it as a bit of a 2-month budget?
I think it's probably a budget that the Treasurer probably didn't want to hand down because of the electoral framing of it. I think I've sat in that budgetary place around 7 or 8 times. So the budget has lost its zing. As an event, it used to be this figure piece of, what's in store for Australia? What's the next 3 years? The forward estimate's going to reveal. I mean, tax cuts, they sound great. They're headline grabbing, but they're pretty piecemeal. They don't kick in for a while. We'll have an election coming up, and the budget could have been a chance to actually introduce the reform question. And, I think Australians are ready for reform, serious reform, particularly around the tax component. I was very interested to read through that budget. They've got baked in deficits. A lot of the problems too is that we've baked in bracket creep, and that seems to be propping up our budgets. And again, reform free, more of the same, fraying at the edges. We don't seem to be able to address the structural problems within Australia's budgetary framework.
I want to come to some of the serious stuff in a moment, and I want to look in particular at a piece that the Australian has put out, just looking at some of the big charts that I think are worth us having a little bit of a chat about. But first, some of the slightly more amusing perspective from a, let's say, more radical, perhaps libertarian or classical liberal perspective, which I quite like, on the Nation First Substack of George Christensen, one of his writers, who I know to be an economist, writing anonymously, but pointing out that we're spending, as our gross debt officially is going to cross the $1 trillion mark, that we are spending $3.8 million for giant pandas at the Adelaide Zoo, $17 million in new military support for Ukraine, $36 million to reopen our embassy in Kiev, and $165 million to expand the Solomon Islands police force, which adds up to around about $222 million, almost $250 million of taxpayers' money handed out to pandas and foreign governments. I mean, this is hardly an austerity budget for a country that's looking at massive debt and whose Reserve Bank is screaming out for government to tighten spending, Gene.
Yes, I mean, clearly it's not an austerity budget. This current treasurer doesn't believe in austerity. I mean, he doesn't believe in economic rationalism. He put out his essay a couple of years ago about values-based capitalism. So he's got a particular vision. I think we do need a thorough review of spending, but we're not going to get it from this current government.
Well, what is his theory, Gene, and where is he coming from? Can you explain that to us, that idea of values-based capitalism, as he calls it? Because it just sounded like socialism when I read that report a couple of years ago, that he wrote a couple of years ago.
Well, yeah, I think it's an expansion of the mixed economy we have. So we do have many policies that years ago would be considered socialism in Australia. I mean, we have Medicare, which, I mean, they don't have something like that in the US, and there's their concern over there about socialised medicine but we've embraced it. I think that's remarkable. You know, Medicare is something that is popular, and now we have the NDIS. So we've got elements of our system that are relatively socialist, you could say. But you know, Chalmers's vision is to sort of expand more of that, to have more of that. I'd say it's a rejection of economic rationalism, because from the 80s through to the 90s, you could argue that we had policies that were market oriented. We were privatizing, we were cutting tariffs, we were deregulating, and those policies, I think, did yield substantial gains. But at the same time, there were some privatizations that went wrong, and there's been this community reaction against economic rationalism, and so there is a resurgence of, say, economic nationalism worldwide, and that's part of it. There's that side of it. There's also, on the left, there's a rejection of that economic rationalism that you may have associated with the Hawke-Keating government and then Howard Costello, and it's just an embrace of, let's have the government, let's have a mission economy, let's have the government directing things, let's get excited about the government investing in science and technology. That's essentially what Chalmers believes in, from what I can tell.
But can that work, Gene? I mean, do you really, is that, I mean, we talk about rejecting economic rationalism in a sense that we're not just rejecting rationalism. I mean, can we really have an economy directed by government that would prosper? I mean, where does the money come from if we're not being economically rational about things?
Well, I don't agree with his policy direction. I think it's the wrong direction. I think we need to rely upon free markets as much as we can, because people are going to look after their own money much better than the government will look after it. I mean, the quadrants of Milton Friedman, where he talks about the worst situation where you're spending other people's money on other people, and that's government, right? You're not spending your own money on yourself or someone else. You're spending other people's money on other people, and the level of care is just it's not going to be there. So yeah, I'm certainly not a fan of this sort of mission economy or values-based capitalism that the Treasurer has embraced. I wish he were more like Paul Keating. I think there's been a lot of commentary today about, and I saw it in the Oz, I think I saw it in the AFR, Chalmers did a PhD thesis on the leadership style of Paul Keating. He was obviously very, he was obsessed with Keating. And I think Keating had a lot of good qualities, but Chalmers just doesn't seem to be embracing them. Maybe in some aspects, but certainly not in economic policy. Keating was one of probably the best treasurers that this country's ever had, in terms of being able to steer a course toward more rational or better budgets in the late 80s, in terms of really tightening expenditure when it needed to be tightened. So yeah, this current treasurer is just he really is just not living up to that example.
The Other Side with Damian Coorey is Australia's best independent news commentary show. As we enter our 5th year, we're going to be bringing you more content via our YouTube and X channels at Other Side Oz with The Other Side Unplugged. More content when it matters, but only when it matters, so you don't miss a thing. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel at Other Side Oz by clicking the button and the bell below the picture frame, and follow us on X now at Other Side Oz. That's AUS at Other Side Oz. It's free. This is The Other Side.
Getting the balance right in a mixed economy, I guess, is the critical thing. And the question is, do you think we have the balance anywhere near right at the moment? And how do we pay for? I mean, we do have the Reserve Bank saying, look, you've got to cut government spending. You've got to get government spending under control before we're going to be reducing interest rates, because that's they believe, one of the main drivers of inflation. What are your thoughts on the direction it should be going in versus the direction that Chalmers seems to be wanting to take us?
Well, at a minimum, I mean, before Dan jumps in, we need to correct that structural deficit. So and I think Dan might have mentioned this before, we've got all these deficits baked in, and it's not because the economy's weak or we're in a recession, because the government, I think Luke Yeaman from Commonwealth Bank and his note pointed this out, the budget's actually showing an economy that is strengthening over the forward estimates over the next 4 years. But we've actually got this significant, 1% of GDP structural deficit. And I think this is probably in that chart, those series of charts you want to show, Damian, of what the critical ones, this structural budget balance. That is something that needs to be addressed by this government in the next few years, rather than just relying on bracket creep to sort of eventually remove it mid next decade. I think that's too long. And I mean, if this government stays in, by mid next decade, we'll have all sorts of additional expenditure. So yeah, I mean, who knows whether they'll actually correct the structural deficit even if they stay in power.
Yeah, Dan, thoughts on that?
I think the bracket creep issue for me is a big one. The other thing too is the future of work, and so like income tax is reliant on more people being in full-time work. Now that is changing a lot. People are taking 2 jobs or 3 jobs, or they're organising themselves as a small business, and so that reliability of income stream is also changing as well. And additionally, the people that earn money from government, either directly or indirectly, has also gone up by a significant factor. So that is if you look at the employment picture, that is people, obviously where their taxes come from. I think that the biggest employer now in Australia is health, but a large chunk of that workforce is in part-time casual, and then it becomes professional services, and you then have retail, and of course government and those essential services. You actually don't have much in the private sector, really delivering much beyond services-based businesses, and that's a bit of a problem if we're only relying on ag and resources, because even on the resources space, iron ore is not really kicking the way it once was, because China's built everything it needs except for more military, of course. So you got these problems where you start baking in stuff, and when you keep kicking the can down the road, it sounds like I'm going back to the European debt crisis, but that's what it was. This kicking the can down the road, and it's kind of, if you're getting more money through bracket creep and handing him a little bit back through tax cuts as a headline, you just become more uncompetitive. And when you become more uncompetitive, then, the knock-on effect happens. So I just look at the budget, and, what Jean was saying is, if we look at these things, the structural stuff, the deficits are continuing to rise. That net percentage of GDP in terms of debt is going up, and everyone says, "Oh, it's not as bad as the rest of the world." It's still ticking up, and that's a problem.
Don't we have? I mean, that question of it not being as bad as the rest of the world, our debt, because it's a percentage of GDP, as you say, it's not as high as other countries. But don't we have a higher level of private debt in Australia, particularly household debt in Australia?
We've got an extraordinary amount of household debt in Australia, and again, it's the Canadians who are also facing an election, only next month. They're talking. Mark Carney, of course, is the Bank of England governor, and the Bank of Canada governor as well. Is now trying his hand at populist politics. But their problem in Canada, of course, is that they're now using a trade war, but to kind of mask their own problems around household debt. In fact, the similarities between the two countries in that space are problematic. And again, it's also a reform issue. I mean, in Australia, the industry of government's clustered around 3 cities, so you don't, beyond that, you got the population base doing really what? It's ag and mining. It's not, like in the reforms that could be done, just the simple things around efficiency are not being done.
Okay, look, I do want to have a look at this article in The Australian, which I think it's entitled The 2025 Federal Budget in 5 charts. Basically, it's 4 charts, I think, with 5 points. The first chart is the underlying cash balance. We see ourselves very much in the red in the next 5 years.
Yes, and I think that is it. There's no reason we should be in the red, given that we're not in a recession. I mean, they really need, again, they need to fix up that structural budget balance. I mean, that's only part of the story, right? I think one of the things Chris Richardson's been emphasising, and I did a paper on this last year for CIS, is that headline cash balance, because there's all this off-budget spending. So there's the underlying cash deficit, but that doesn't include what they call the investments in non-financial assets for policy purposes. So there's this category of outlays in the budget, which is going to things like Clean Energy Finance Corporation and things like that. And
how much of the budget is that, Gene? I mean, is it, what percentage-wise, how much is it?
When I did my paper for CIS, it was about 80 billion over 4 years, so roughly 20 billion a year, but it's probably more than that now.
So just explain it for simple-minded people like me. How can they get away with talking about off-budget spending like that? I mean, it's that magnitude. Yes. I mean, that seems a pretty significantly significant number. Right? It's not a small bit of cash.
Well, they are loans, so they're arguing, well, we're investing in financial assets. So they're either, it's money being invested in, say, NBN or Snowy Hydro, that they'll say, oh well, we need to invest in these businesses so they can build the future infrastructure, or it's loans, so money that's loaned out by, say, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and then eventually that loan will be repaid. The problem is, in the short term, the government does have to borrow money to advance those loans, so to provide the cash for those loans. And often the risk with these government financing vehicles is that they won't be investing in economic projects. They'll be investing in things that are, a lot of, we'll say, renewable energy projects that, for example, that won't be as good investments as other potential projects.
Is there anything really going towards the betterment of actually growing the economy in a sustainable way, where you're creating jobs beyond the government person? The short answer, I'd say, would be if the same old trick is construction, you've got some serious problems, because you can build as many buildings as you like, but if you've got no one inside creating the widgets which people overseas want, I'm not talking manufacturing per se, but like what is there? It's just a build and spend and borrow budget. And again, that's kind of been the theme for the last 2 decades.
We'll be back in just a moment. The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective, like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside. Joining me now on the other side, Unplugged, we continue our discussion about the federal budget for 2025 with Gene Tunney, the economist from Adept Economics, and Dan PETRIE, former Bloomberg and News Corp journalist and regular of the other side and data analyst. Gentlemen, just coming back to this article in the Australian and some of these charts that they're looking at, I like this payments as a percentage of GDP. This is the peak spending, I guess, for each government, how much they spent during their term. I'm not sure that these, how significant it is that Whitlam spent 24.3%, Howard 25% of GDP, and we're now seeing Albanese at 27%, just below the Hawke-Keating era peak. But should we be concerned about this level of spending as a percentage of GDP?
I mean, revenue. I mean, there are two reasons for concern. One, it arguably means a greater role for government and less role for the private sector, crowding out of private sector activity that could be more productive. So I think there's a productivity issue. There's also the fact that it's too much given the amount of revenue the Commonwealth's raising, and that's why we have that structural deficit.
Is that a dangerous level, do you think, at that percentage?
I mean, again, we fall back on international comparisons. I mean, it's not as bad as France or Scandinavia. I mean, when we're not in a situation where the debt's going to spiral or get explosively out of control, and we've still got time to get it under control. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a crisis or an emergency, but it's definitely something we need to address, in my view. Yeah.
Okay, individual taxpayers are bearing the brunt. Another chart showing just how much individual taxpayers are paying of the overall tax burden, which speaks to the bracket creep to a certain extent, and it's going to reach 50%. So individuals paying more than half the tax in the country. Any thoughts on that, Dan?
Plenty, but we've just got this issue we've really got the substantive issue where if you look at the league table of Australia in terms of what it does, it collects far too much in income tax, not enough in consumption taxes, and again, and as a result, its business tax regime is kind of anchored as still somewhat uncompetitive. And in fact, if I look at the general government revenue, it's still not even $100 billion. Yet, if you look at the individual and withholding taxes, as you alluded before, this is just the latest one. It's just under 300 billion. That is an extraordinary problem to have, in the sense that your consumption tax is just not raising enough money, and your income tax is clearly a disincentive for people to work. I mean,
so we should be lifting the GST, is what you're saying.
I
GST
think lift the
go
GST
up and income tax down.
Do you know what? Blind Freddie will tell you, lift the GST.
Yeah. Any thoughts there, G?
I mean, the issue of the GST, that's a challenging one, because there's the efficiency gains from cutting income tax and replacing it with GST, but then there are the concerns that poorer households consume a higher fraction of their income than wealthier households. So that would be one of the concerns you'd have to address, and that's why when John Howard introduced the GST, there was some compensation, wasn't there? Or there was some boost to welfare benefits. I can't remember exactly what the details were, but and that's why you had to do the deal with the Democrats to exempt fresh food and health and education. So we need to be able to give the states a more sustainable share of revenue, so they're not so dependent on all of these government grants. But then the GST, that's being delivered as a grant from the Commonwealth, so that may not be the best way.
Well, it's all about power and control, really, isn't it? I mean, they want to have that ability to turn on and turn off the tap, and to manipulate the states and control the states more, rather than giving them a predictable thing that they can forecast and plan and manage appropriately. Let's have a look at the deficit now. And we were talking briefly about debt before, but I mean, this is where we're heading. So we've got looks like 907 billion. For last financial year, 940 billion for this financial year, and then we're increasing over the trillion mark 2025-26 up to 1.2 trillion in 28-29. Now, this is just federal gross debt, right? So we've got to add the ever increasing, spiraling and very concerning state debt to all of this, which means we're getting well over the 1.5 trillion mark, and very close to, the high end of the ones, up to the 2. Can we continue to say that we do have an acceptable level of debt versus our GDP when you bring the state numbers in and add them to this in terms of total government debt?
I think depends on what you mean by acceptable, Damien. I mean, we can certainly service it, but that comes at a cost, doesn't it? So, I mean, there's
What would the average interest rate be down, Gene? It'd be about 4 now,
we'll
or
have to do the calculation.
but even so, if we're talking about $1 trillion, okay, so at 3%, 3.5%, that's what, 35 billion?
Yeah. Well, you can
35
see the
billion?
figures in the budget what the interest expenses are, and it'll be getting up around that. So yes, that's the cost, and that's how the debt impacts the budget. It means you've got less money for health and education and defence.
If you're paying off that level of interest and you're paying down the principal to a certain amount, say 5% a year, then you're looking at, about 10% of the federal budget, aren't you?
Well, the secret is, Damien, that they don't pay down the principal. They just simply borrow the money when they have to refund the bonds, when they
Right.
have to repay the bondholders. So that's one of the, the privileges that governments have. I mean, they just keep refinancing it. If it gets to a level where the bondholders start to worry that the governments can't actually pay it without monetizing the deficit, for example, and then it's just a matter of, are we willing to pay that level of interest, and how difficult does it make meeting our other priorities in health and education? How difficult does it make life for us? And I think increasingly we are seeing that it is becoming problematic because, well, for one, we've got these baked in structural deficits that you need, but that's not compatible with stable debt over time. If you've got structural deficits like that, you are going to have ever increasing debt, and eventually you'll get to a point where it does become a big problem. So yeah, they need to correct that, or they're going to be in all sorts of strife.
What worries me a bit is, we're talking about it being 55 billion back in 2007. It wasn't really that long ago. Then we went to 100 billion in
True, I was there.
2008.
Yeah.
And now we're talking in the trillions. To
Yeah.
a simple-minded layman like me, that scares me a little bit. I know all the economists and everybody says, well, as a percentage of GDP, it's not as high as other countries. But again, you've got to add the state debt, you've got to add household private debt. I mean, and we only have our GDP, compared to the United States, and another metric I think we should consider is the private equity in the public markets and that sort of thing. I mean, you look at the United States; it's a huge economy. Are we looking at the right thing when I think they've got $63 trillion worth of public market equity, and we've got 2. I don't know. It just seems to me, it just scares me, that sort of level of debt, and I just see government waste and government overspending. But I'm probably the only person. Certainly, nobody's going to be talking about austerity and tightening the belt 2 months before an election. But longer term, do we need to turn around our thinking a little bit and our expectations and the level of spending?
Yes, because that structural deficit, they can't keep that going. That needs to be fixed up. They need to do something beyond just waiting for bracket creep to correct it in 10 years' time, because we know that they'll add additional spending commitments before that bracket creep does what they're hoping it will. So they need to fix that structural deficit up. The Treasury will be advising them to do that, no doubt. And yeah, they'll have to make some tough decisions eventually.
Anything in the budget that struck you as being sort of, a surprisingly healthy demonstration of government spending restraint? Is that a loaded question, Dad? Would you say?
I think the problem is it's the recycling of what we already know. There's a obvious. I think if you talk to the person in the street, they would say that military spending is likely to increase given the uncertainty of some of the comments at the White House. So that's so it's kind of almost a green light for people to spend. I suppose listening to the structural deficit and what Gene was talking about, I'm often reminded, like when people talk about Ronald Reagan as, this great economic reformer, he oversaw a significant structural deficit for a long time in America, and their debt ceiling problems are, they're owed to Republican presidents. As uncomfortable that is for conservatives to acknowledge, that is what they have to face. I mean, but that debt significantly tracked up, and then in terms of restraint, like it's always like when and I'm probably being unfair to the Labor side of politics here, but like Paul Keating, for example, when he was treasurer, they did actually cut real spending after the 1987 stock market crash, and that was actually a significant, belt tightening exercise by government. But generally speaking, they haven't really offered much in terms of any restraint. In fact, the idea of, housing future funds and housing funds, this idea of creating funds as the panacea to not reform is your problem, because government, no matter what they say, will never be able to do the work the private sector can do in terms of achieving an outcome, whether it be in construction, developing a product to market, innovation. And why? Because it's just not in the DNA. The bureaucracy is too slow, moves too slowly. Not saying it doesn't move, but just doesn't have the ability to deliver many of the things that government's now getting into the area of, like they are offering. We're talking about the NDIS before, and aged care, for example. Like they're getting the business of trying to manufacture outcomes, and any areas restraint? No, nothing. Sorry, there's just nothing. It's this continual creation of funds and kind of headlines to kick the can down the road.
All right, gentlemen, we'll take another quick break and we'll come back shortly. I want to talk about the Olympic plan for Brisbane, the city in which you guys are sitting. And we'll have a chat about the cost of that, the games, whether it's all going to be totally worth it. We'll be back in a sec. You may have noticed if you've been overseas on holiday recently that you can log into your streaming services like Netflix or Prime in other countries, but the shows they offer are different and sometimes even better. You're paying good money for those subscription services. Why can't you watch? Well, with a virtual private network, or VPN, you can log in from home here in Australia with an internet address from anywhere in the world, and big corporations and big government can't see where you are. Now, to be clear, criminals can still be actively found with police warrants, of course, but the average honest citizen will have their location protected from prying eyes of corporate marketers and government bureaucrats. If you sign up now with private internet access, we think they are the best VPN service out there. That's private internet access. As a viewer of The Other Side, you can get 83% off the price of your subscription and get online for less than $3 a month. Check it out right now. Go to piavpn.com/otherside. That's piavpn.com/otherside. It's a great service at a rock bottom price, and you're helping keep The Other Side going and growing. Welcome back to The Other Side Unplugged, and we're talking to economist Jean TUNNY and data analyst and journalist Dan PETRIE. Jean, the Brisbane Olympic Games plan was sort of announced this week, in most of it anyway. We're getting a sense that we're going to get a new stadium, obviously, lots of other little things, a massive world-class, world-leading aquatic centre, which could be very positive. It seems like the Queensland government has gone for the option of looking at the bigger picture longer term and thinking about the game's legacy and the impact that will have on, the spending going to something for the future rather than just the Olympic Games.
I mean, the problem was we spent 4 years or something just spinning our wheels or not really going anywhere in terms of the Olympics. So they've got to try and progress it as quickly as they can, or otherwise we're going to face huge cost blowouts. So first, I wouldn't have bid for the Olympics in the first place. I didn't think it was sensible. I think the history shows that it's very rare that cities do well out of the Olympics. Maybe Barcelona, maybe LA, because they were able to use their previous stadium. I was very concerned we were going to end up with a high cost option. We'd end up having to spend a whole bunch of more money. The previous government said, "Oh no, we'll deliver it cost effectively. We'll use existing venues. It'll just be $1 billion for the Gabba." But now we're talking, many more billions I mean, what is it, 6 or 7 billion?
7.1.
7.1 billion.
Can we afford it though, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think we could certainly afford it, but we're going to end up with more debt. We may end up losing the credit rating. There's a big question about the state government's finances, you would have seen, because the treasurer, David Janetsky, he released his budget update, the mid-year fiscal and economic review.
This is the new Queensland government, which is a
Yep.
Liberal National Party government now. Yep.
Yeah, and so there's I mean, according to the new government, there was all of the spending that wasn't the spending blowouts that weren't declared. So there's a bit of controversy about that. To what extent has that been sort of exaggerated? But that certainly, I think the situation was worse than the previous government projected. I was very critical of the previous government. I didn't think they had a grasp on the budget. I mean, we had the $1,000 being given out for electricity rebates, the 50-cent fares. I mean, all sorts of craziness. And I mean, now we've got to pay for the Olympics. So look, it's going to be a big challenge for the government to be able to do this, and at the same time, not have another notch taken off the credit rating. So we could have a credit rating downgrade, which means higher borrowing costs. So it is going to be a big challenge for this government to be able to deliver it.
A lot of excitement this week that we've actually got a plan now and we can move forward on it. And there is it is inspiring when you build something new and shiny. It does sort of have its own momentum and energy to it. So I don't want to be too much of a downer on the idea of sort of, building something and creating something, and at least investing in infrastructure that is probably going to be positive for the city for the future. But yeah, it does raise the question. I mean, I find it hard to believe that if Dan Andrews thought the Commonwealth Games was going to cost Victoria, I think $7 billion, that we're going to be able to keep the Olympic Games in that budget bracket. What are your thoughts, Dan?
I remember when the Cross River Rail was $5 billion, and I think it ended up being, I think by the time it's completed, it'll be $11 billion. It's probably a good thing for the city of Brisbane to have the renewal around stadia infrastructure and to be close to the Eka Showgrounds, so the Royal National Showgrounds there at Gregory Terrace. They junked this idea of Brisbane Live, which was to sit on top of the Roma Street parklands. I go back to Gene's points, I think is the correct one. You'd never bid for the Olympics, but now that we have, I don't think it'll turn money for the state of Queensland, but I do think what it will do is probably provide Brisbane, it'll elevate it to, a standing of Sydney and Melbourne in terms of having the entertainment infrastructure and the precinct in place, which is closer to what Victoria has, which I think will pay dividends over the decades. But
Paul, I think there was a KPMG, or was it Ernst & Young, maybe KPMG, I think, that did a report that I think they put it out yesterday or earlier in the week to try and sort of demonstrate the flow-on economic effects of the Games. Now, I know there have been a lot of studies in the past done, right, that have shown that the Olympic Games don't have the flow-on economic effect that's anticipated. But this was glowing. This was like, it's going to bring in, truckloads in terms of the impact of the future, especially with the new plan of the Christodoulou government. I'm just wondering if, while a lot of cities around the world are reluctant to bid for the Games now, and that's probably partly how Brisbane won it. I think we were one of two, last man standing sort of situation with the.
I think Istanbul put their hand up as a Hail
There's
Mary.
a German city too in there somewhere.
Yeah, Hamburg I think had a crack. So
yeah, but I think there are certain cities that are at a certain position in their life, I guess, where an event like the Olympic Games can really take them to the next level. And I think if any city in the world would fit the bill for the sort of city that could probably benefit a lot from an Olympics to really put it on the map at the right stage of its growth, that it might be Brisbane. That it really would make a difference.
I actually think they got it right in terms of the venues. I grew up in the 80s and I remember QE2 well. I saw the Pope there, I think, in 1986.
Bless you, my son. And the Commonwealth Games, of course, in 1982, which was why it was built.
I think I was about 7 or 8 off it. I'll be kind to myself. But on a very serious note, the fact of the matter is that Brisbane is one of these classic Western style cities where the car is king, and so they're not particularly efficient, these suburbia style spreads. In fact, they actually kind of took their lead from America when shopping malls became quite popular. So this kind of idea of improving your civic infrastructure so that the town, that band, that 5 kilometre band, for example, is an attractive place for people to come, and it serves an entertainment value. That's a big, big, big positive for a city such as this one. The second point I also want to make on these Olympics is that there is some regional things going on in terms of, yes, Rockhampton get the rowing. I don't know if the rowers like it too much being in a croc river, but that's life. Toowoomba
They'll
gets
row
the,
faster. That's the incentive. We'll get some real world records.
I mean,
Yeah.
Toowoomba gets the equestrian, which is, I think, they signal that pretty hard, and the Gold Coast will get a bunch of things, and the Sunshine Coast will also do well. I mean, the idea that the Olympics should really be, I hope it actually sets a template for the other cities and countries that, no, it shouldn't be one city where you can walk, 5 meters and you're watching the wrestling, and another 10 meters you just lob in and you watch the swimming. It is a gigantic festival.
Spread it around a bit, get
spread it
benefit
around,
from the whole of a state or a country. Yeah.
Exactly. There we are.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. I will press on with the Olympics. I don't think there's any question that it's going to move forward, and we've got to deliver it now. So hopefully we'll be able to do that and not send Queensland broke and have Standard & Poor's downgrade us and Fitch downgrade us, and we wind up paying 2% extra for our debt. All right, gents. Well, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back, and I want to talk about, because again, I get very confused by economics. I love having you guys on, so I want to get some sense around what Donald Trump's up to with tariffs. So if you can help me understand that, that would be fantastic. Stand by, everybody. We're going to dive into that one next. So you don't miss a thing, be sure to subscribe on YouTube by clicking the subscribe button below this video and the little bell, and that way you'll get notified when we post new stuff, and that's free. But more importantly, we really need you to help our mission. So if you can spare 5 or 10 or 20 bucks a month and you want to get behind what we're doing at the other side so we can do more of it, please head over to othersidetv.com.au and sign up to the exclusive side and support us for less than $1 a week. We really do need your support. That's othersidetv.com.au. And even if you can't afford to support us financially, you can also sign up for free over there, and we can still keep in touch if the misinformation and any safety police come after us. Othersidetv.com.au, our new website. Check it out. Welcome back to The Other Side Unplugged, and I'm joined by esteemed economist from Adept Economics, Director of Adept Economics, Jean TUNNY, and also our regular on the other side, Dan PETRIE, who is a former Bloomberg and News Corporation journalist, data analyst, and all-around pretty smart guy. So, gentlemen, if I could start with you, Jean, for a bit of a 101 on this Donald Trump trade tariffs adventure. Why do governments introduce tariffs when actually it's going to mean it's an inflationary move? It's going to put prices up and punish their own people. What's the end game? What's the reason that tariffs are used normally?
Okay, so there's a revenue raising aspect of it, but the reason that Trump is putting them up is because he's using them as a bargaining tool, isn't he? So he's trying to get concessions out of other countries. I mean, he thinks that the US has been ripped off by China, that Canada isn't stopping the fentanyl getting in, that Mexico's sending all of these criminals, it's not controlling the border. So he's trying to use it to get concessions. And he also thinks we've been dumping aluminium into the US and steel. So there's a whole bunch of grievances that Trump has, that he thinks that if he uses these tariffs, he can force concessions from other countries. So he's using it as a bargaining tool. Now, having said that, and the points you make about, it increases the cost of goods to consumers and also business, they're fair points. In the international economics literature, so if you think about the theory, there is some justification for a large country like the United States in the absence of retaliation, imposing a tariff, because to an extent you can get the foreigners to pay for part of it. You won't get them to pay for all of it, or even the majority of it, but they can pay for part of it because the US is such a large buyer, and it can actually influence the terms of trade that are offered it. Nick Gruen and I wrote a piece on this for Crikey where we set out all of these considerations that there could be some sort of logic to what Trump's doing. However, when you take into account the retaliation against the United States, just the ultimate breakdown in the sort of rules-based global order that they talk about, the fact that it is a retreat, we're going away from free trade, which does make us all countries, I think, benefit from that ultimately. Certainly Australia does. It's a bad move, but I'd say the logic is it's a bargaining tool, and also that conceivably it could help with the terms of trade for the US.
Imposing a 25% tariff on imported cars starting April 2nd. Trump says it's going to generate $100 billion annually and will boost U.S. manufacturing.
Basically, I view it as reducing taxes and also reducing debt. And within a fairly short period of time, I think we're going to have a balance sheet that's going to be outstanding.
The president insists the tariffs are permanent, part of his broader push to reshape trade and reduce the budget deficit. Meantime, the new tariffs are sparking backlash. Canada and the EU warn of retaliation, saying the move hurts consumers and workers.
Isn't it also, Gene, that he wants to try to bring the supply chain home and to, it's a nationalism move that he's trying to make America more self-sufficient, less reliant on an interconnected global economy, but, basically that, America will be able to make its own stuff again and not be so reliant on China. From that perspective, does it make sense, and is it a good way to approach it?
Well, I certainly don't think so. I don't think that's the way to make a prosperous economy, because unless it's obvious that the other country is subsidizing or it's it is dumping its products into your country, and then you can justifiably have some countervailing tariffs or some tariffs to try and offset that. But too often these tariffs get imposed for the reason to protect the domestic industry, but it just means the domestic industry can be more inefficient, and it's not going to be competitive, and it means higher prices for consumers and businesses for their input. So that is the argument. There is that argument for, well, let's protect industry, maybe let's reshore. I just don't know how feasible that is, given how globally connected the economy is now and how to spread across the world those supply chains are. It'll take a lot of investment, and it'll take time for that reshoring to occur in the US. And in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of pain for consumers and businesses.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly split the right, that's for sure, in America, in terms of, free trade advocates who believe in all of the great benefits of free trade and making everything cheaper and more efficient, and divvying out the production to the places that are more efficient at producing things. There's a whole school of economics on that, which I won't get into, but yeah, I mean, that's the theory of the benefit of free trade. But then I guess there's the counter argument, which is, should we be free trade with everybody, or should we just free trade with people who more or less share our democratic Western liberal sort of values to a certain extent? Should we necessarily have been free trading so much with countries that don't share our values and in fact empowering, in some cases, enemy states? So it's splitting people along those lines, both economically, politically, and their thinking. Dan, any thoughts from your side on this? I mean, how do you view it? Is it a stupid move completely, or is there some sense to it all?
I think it's too broad brush. I mean, the idea, I personally think tariffs are stupid, right? The way they've been done with the stroke of a pen and executive orders, especially against China. Of course, China's also the biggest holder of US Treasury bonds, which also is another.
Right.
And in the case of the Canadians, they export a lot of their own energy. It's just a bizarre way of doing things. I mean, like the clip that's come up that people have put up is Ronald Reagan talking about how they specifically had an issue with Japanese semiconductor chips in 1987, but they were all for free trade. Ultimately, this is just my view. I've always thought that innovation and higher up the chain of innovation, that advanced manufacturing, for a better example, is where it's all at. And eventually, I think JD Vance has been arguing the fact that giving up manufacturing has been a terrible thing, but it's also part of a country's evolution. In a lot of cases in Australia, the idea of saying, let's get manufacturing going again. Well, historically, that'd be wonderful, but the truth of the matter is it's not this noble vocation. 1.1 million people used to work in that industry in Australia. Now it's less than 800,000. And it's basically
But it does make us more dependent and, less independent, I guess, on our neighbours and on our trading partners and on the supply chains. There is a geopolitical risk there, right? Especially these days.
I think that's a very fair point. But at the same time, if you're going to go for this idea of every person for themselves, then it's ultimately it's going to be very expensive. Is it necessarily the best use of capital for every person for themselves when they can get a product from somewhere else? I'd say it's probably not the best use, but again, I just look at the numbers and the flow. The aluminium thing about America, where they just said, they're going to put tariffs on everything from Australia. Well, the actual raw aluminium ores that come from this country in 2024, like $60 million worth of export went to the United States out of 14 billion.
Tiny.
So it's the interconnected nature, the way capital markets, and it seems bizarre to go down this path, and particularly to impose tariffs on allies and only create the spear, if you like, of uncertainty. So I think it's a madness, but again,
I do think the American taxpayers have been, carrying the can on a lot of things for a lot of other countries for a long time. And if I was an American taxpayer, I'd be pretty annoyed, but I don't know that this is the right way to go about fixing that.
I think certainly the grievances around foreign policy, like isolationism, is not a new phenomenon in American life. That's certainly been, I think that's very fair. And I think that's thrown up a lot about Ukraine. Why should the poor old worker in Arkansas fund that war? Sure, but again, but when you want to be the leader of the free world, that's just the chocolates you get as well. So that's my hot take, Damian. But I just think that the tariffs are a blunt force negotiating tactic, which they'll eventually walk away from because it makes no sense.
Do you think they'll walk away from it, Gene? Eventually, they'll have to.
I'd like to think that common sense will prevail, and look, this administration won't last forever, so I expect that there'll be changes in the future. But look,
could it have the desired effect that Trump wants, though? Do you think he'll get the results that he wants to get out of it, at least in the short term?
Well, I think there's all sorts of retaliation against him so far, and I honestly don't think this is good policy. I think it's going to have adverse economic consequences for the states. We saw what happened to the stock market. The stock market was one of the indicators that Trump was very proud of at his first presidency. And I think the markets were very excited when Trump was elected. But since he's been undertaking these tariff measures, they've really plunged. So,
why do you think he's doing it in such a blanket way? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. It would be much better, more effective if it was more pinpoint, right?
Look, I honestly don't know what the logic is, Damian. It's all very strange. But if you adopt that sort of old, sort of what they call mercantilist perspective, so it's mercantilism, this idea that, well, we need to really have the trade balance as a focus of economic policy, then that can drive this type of behaviour where you're obsessed about it and you think, the way to fix that up is through tariffs. So that's part of his thinking. I think it's partly through it's that concern over the size of the deficit. It is, there's protectionism. There's also let's make the foreigners pay for part of the tariffs. Let's try and improve our terms of trade. That's all part of it, I suppose. But yeah, I don't think it makes much sense myself. And I think the market, what we've seen in the share market, is reflecting the reality that this is going to be cause adverse economic consequences for the US.
What other things can a government do, Gene, if they want to kind of shore up their local capabilities and become more self-sufficient in manufacturing and in the supply chain?
Well, I think this is where we need to have much better policies, what you call structural policies, things like industrial relations, education, training, that sort of thing, which means that we've got the foundations to be more competitive, to be attractive destinations for investment, or for to actually produce things at low enough cost that we can sell them. That it makes sense to produce here. We've got a lot of high cost, operations, high cost business. The governments are imposing all sorts of taxes and charges on us. There are all sorts of regulations in the labour market and industrial relations that mean that it's much more expensive to employ people. This current government has, it introduced its closing loopholes regulation, which is making it harder to use labour hire. So there are all sorts of things that we're doing that make it hard to run a business in this country and make it difficult. So I'd be looking at those types of policies.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing it home to Australia there. It's a good point to end on. Any final comments from you, Dan?
What's the 4 factors of production? I think that was the. I'd have to go back to the textbooks, but that was isn't that the obvious thing? They're making capital and plant and equipment and all those things, accessible. I got nothing to add. I've really enjoyed the chat. I love hearing from Gene. I love the blog, Gene. I haven't. I hope that keeps ticking over, because that's just a treasure trove. The Queensland.
Give it a quick plug, Gene.
Queensland Economy Watch, the best. I love it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I haven't been doing much of that lately. I've been focusing more on the podcast, but I'll see if I can revive it, or maybe have more of an Australian flavour. But yeah, the podcast is the thing I've been focused on, Economics Explored. So I'm trying to cover a range of international issues there, just to expand my horizons.
All right, Economics Explored podcast, available on all the usual platforms, I presume, Gene?
Yes, Apple Podcasts and
Spotify,
etc. Yep.
Fantastic. And Dan, you want to give your data stuff a bit of a plug as well?
Yeah, so I'm releasing the first version of Data Digger coming up. So datadigger.com.au, and you can plug in there and just register your interest, and you'll be able to chart to your heart's content.
Data Digger, digger.com.au.
Yeah, it's a Data Digger as part of their chart economy group of businesses. So there we are.
Excellent. We'll be talking a lot more about that on the other side in the weeks ahead, no doubt. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Dan PETRIE, data wizard, former Bloomberg and News Corp journalist, and Gene TUNNY, Director of Adept Economics and Economist. Thank you for your time today, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective, like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside.
Stay in touch. Check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month.